Welcome to Haunted Talks, the official podcast of The Haunted Walk, offering thematic walking tours in Toronto, Ottawa, and Kingston, Ontario. My name is Jim Dean. I am the creative director of the company, and I really appreciate you joining us. I'm really looking forward to sharing today's topic with you, which was a book published in England in 1911. Firstly, because it's been a while since we've really explored a creepy ghost story, so I'm looking forward to that aspect of it. But also, this story takes place at one of the most popular tourist attractions in the world. And if you've listened to any of the previous episodes, particularly the one about Disney's Haunted Mansions, you know, aside from the Haunted Walk, I think tourist attractions are really cool, and I love taking a look at them. The book in question is entitled An Adventure, and represents the account and research of two well-respected English women who experienced some kind of time slip in the gardens of the Palace of Versailles outside Paris on August 10th, 1901. They apparently walked through the gardens as they were on August 10th, 1792, the day the French monarchy fell during the French Revolution. They wrote a book about this called An Adventure, though the incident is also known as The Ghosts of Petit Trianon. This account is remarkable for its detail of the accounts of the two women and the efforts they went to establish the historical evidence for their belief that they had strayed into the past. They wrote the book under the pseudonyms Elizabeth Morrison and Frances Lamont, though their actual names were Charlotte Moberly, who was 55 years old at the time, and Eleanor Jourdain, who was 38. Morris's father was the headmaster at the prestigious Winchester School and later Bishop of Salisbury. She was the principal of a hall of residence for women at Oxford University, and Lamont was appointed as her assistant. Lamont's father was the vicar of the Church of England, and she was appointed to be Moberly's assistant. At the time, she was working as a tutor in Paris, and Morrison went to visit her there to get to know her a bit better before she took the job. Their visit to Versailles on August 10th, 1901, was one of a number of tourist trips together they took while in Paris. It wasn't until about a week after their trip to Versailles that the two women began to talk about their experience, as Miss Morrison was writing a letter to her friends about the different trips and things they were going on, when as she began to write the bit about Versailles, she felt some of the same very eerie, compressed feelings she had while on the grounds. At which point, she turned to Ms. Lamont and said, "Do you think Petit Trianon is haunted?" And she replies, "Yes, I do." She asks, "Which part of it?" She then describes having the same feelings at more or less the same places on the property, despite the two of them not speaking about it on the day of. 3 months later, the pair realized that while they had experienced many of the same things while on the grounds, each of them had seen things the other did not, but should have. Over the next 10 years, the two conduct their own investigation involving multiple trips to Versailles, trips to archives, consulting old maps, and interviews with experts. In 1911, they publish An Adventure, which contains each of their first-hand accounts written months after their first visit, extremely detailed and footnoted evidence related to what they witnessed. And that is not an understatement. There are footnotes literally everywhere throughout this document. All of this evidence somehow leads them to conclude that they had stepped back in time, or slipped in time. The book sold extremely well, and their story became quite well known. But as you might imagine, there was also a great deal of skepticism. Some even went so far is to call the women liars. Before we get to their experiences, I do have an update on some of the special events we're going to be running this summer. We are joining in the celebrations for Canada 150 with a special tour that's going to run about 2 weeks before Canada Day and 2 weeks after Canada Day in Ottawa, and it's going to be called 150 Years of Canada's Scariest Ghost Stories. We'll share a few of our local favorites, but then we're going to branch off into some of our favorite ghost stories from coast to coast. The tour will also include a visit inside the Bytown Museum, which is one of Ottawa's oldest and certainly most haunted buildings. So if you're going to be around Ottawa late June, early July, that is one you're definitely going to want to check out. 150 years of Canada's scariest ghost stories. I'm also pleased to announce that after our very successful Halloween season run at Black Creek Pioneer Village in Toronto, we're bringing that program into the summer for 2017. So on select Saturday nights in July, August, and very early September, you'll be able to join us at Black Creek Pioneer Village. Now, we had a really interesting time there in that while giving the tours, some of our most experienced staff had some very strange experiences. Now, we've been able to include those in the tour for this year, so if you went last year, there's even some new material in there, and we really have a lot of fun at Black Creek. So that's running July, August, early September on select Saturday evenings. To learn more about those tours or any of our tours, visit our website, hauntedwalk.com, and be sure to follow us on social media, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Snapchat, all of them at Haunted Walk. Before we get to the women's experiences on the grounds of Versailles, I think maybe a little historical context is needed. And the Palace of Versailles gets its start in 1624, after King Louis XIII visits the area as part of a hunting trip, and he decides that a royal chateau, or hunting lodge, should be set up right there. This rather modest chateau was enlarged into a royal palace by King Louis XIV. He added in lush grounds featuring incredible gardens and water features, and the palace grounds stretched to 800 hectares, or about 8 kilometers square. One of the most baffling aspects in the study of Versailles is just to figure out how much it may have cost to build this opulent palace. But one interesting note for us Canadians listening to the show is that some of the money actually did come from New France, which would have been Quebec City, parts of Quebec, down into the United States. And as these were not owned by the people of France, but New France was owned by the king, he was receiving revenues that went directly into funding for Versailles. Estimates of the amount spent to build Versailles are speculative, but in 2000, a number came out that it was the equivalent of $2 billion in today's money. The current worth of Versailles is about $50 billion. The royal court was officially established there on May 6, 1682, and by moving his court and government to Versailles, Louis XVI hoped to extract more control over the government from the nobility and distance himself from the population of France. All of the power of France emanated from this center. There were government offices at Versailles, as well as homes of thousands of courtiers and other functionaries of the court. By requiring that nobles of a certain rank and position spend time each year at Versailles, Louis prevented them from developing their own regional power at the expense of his own, and kept them from countering his efforts to centralize the French government in an absolute monarchy. His queen, Marie Antoinette, also loved the property and enjoyed spending time there, often in solitude. This brings us back to August 10th, 1901, and the visit of the grounds by Ms. Moberly and Lamont. And to be honest, they were not particularly looking forward to their visit of Versailles, as they thought it would be quite dull, and they didn't have much historical understanding to appreciate what they were seeing. Their adventure really begins when they set out from the main palace to visit a smaller, more secluded area called Petit Trianon, where the Queen, Marie Antoinette, spent a great deal of her time. On their way to that area, they missed the direct path and ended up taking a much longer route. As this error became apparent to Ms. Moberly, they walked past a woman shaking a white cloth from the window of a small building. And Ms. Moberly was quite surprised when Miss Lamont, who was leading them, did not ask the woman for directions. When each of the women write down their accounts, it's discovered that Ms. Lamont did not see this woman or this building at all. And this is the first example of the women seeing different things. They wander around a little longer trying to find the way, and they eventually come across a path that divides into 3. And in the middle of the center path, they see 2 men. Ms. Moberly writes in the book, "Afterwards, we spoke of them as gardeners, because we remembered a wheelbarrow of some kind close by and the look of a pointed spade. But they were really very dignified officials, dressed in long, green-grayish coats with small three-cornered hats. They directed us straight on. In her version of the account, Ms. Lamont writes of these gardeners, "I remember repeating my question to them because they'd answered in a seemingly casual and mechanical way, but got no other answer than the same one I had received, and in the same manner." While standing with the gardeners, she looks over and sees not far from the path a cottage with a woman and a girl standing in the doorway. She noticed they were both wearing old-fashioned clothing. Even the girl had a dress down to her ankles. The woman was passing her a jug and wore a white cap. And though in plain sight to Ms. Lamont, Ms. Moberly did not see the cottage, the woman, or the girl. And while the directions the gardeners had given them seemed somewhat counterintuitive, as the woman believed it would lead them farther from their destination, Petit Trianon, and lead them into a dense wood, they decided to follow the instruction, as they were sure that these workers on the palace grounds would know the best route to take. It was at this point, and though they did not discuss it at the time, that both of them began to feel extremely uneasy, depressed, as if confined. In the woods, they stumble upon a structure they refer to as a kiosk, which is a circular open-air structure with a short retaining wall around it, supported by columns. Sitting beside this kiosk was a man wearing a cloak and a large floppy hat. This dress seemed incongruous with the current temperature, as this was a hot, humid August afternoon. Both women had very strong reactions to this kiosk and this man. Ms. Moberly writes, "Everything suddenly looked unnatural or unpleasant. Even the trees behind the building seemed to become flat and lifeless." Ms. Lamont wrote, "At that moment, the eerie feeling which had begun in the garden culminated in a definite impression of something uncanny and fear-inspiring. The man slowly turned his face, which was marked by smallpox. His complexion was very dark. The expression was very evil and yet unseeing, and though I did not feel that he was looking particularly at us, I felt a repugnance to go past him. But I did not wish to show the feeling, which I thought was meaningless, and we talked about the best way to turn and decided to go right." It was at that point they heard the sound of someone running up to them in haste. When they looked, there was no one on the path, but they suddenly became aware of a presence directly beside them, in front of a large rock formation. He was tall, a handsome gentleman, though his face was glowing red, as though through great exertion. He called out to them in French, "Ladies, you must not go that way. Go this way. Look for the house." As the path would take them away from the figure at the kiosk, both women were happy to go that direction. As Ms. Moberly turned her head to join Ms. Lamont in thanking the man for his directions, she turns and he is gone. And then hears the sound of running, moving away from them. Later, the women cannot explain how this person got over or around the rock formation without them being aware of their presence. They also made note particularly of this person's shoes, which they described as old-fashioned and with a buckle. As they continue, they cross over a small rustic bridge and finally arrive at Petit Trianon. On the grass in front of the house, Ms. Moberly observes a woman holding out a paper at arm's length, seeming like she is sketching. Moberly said the woman definitely saw them, and as they walked by, the figure looked at both of them straight on. Ms. Moberly wrote, "I thought she was a tourist, but her dress was old-fashioned and rather unusual. I looked straight at her, but some indescribable feeling made me want to turn away, as if I were annoyed at her being there." Despite walking side by side with Ms. Moberly, Ms. Lamont did not see this woman sketching at all. But she did strongly remember, as they arrived on the front lawn of Petit Trianon, the place was deserted, but for some reason she felt the need to draw her skirt away, as if to move it out of someone's way. They walked up some steps to a nearby terrace, but the entire feeling of the place is really starting to get to them. It feels oppressive and unnatural. Suddenly, from a house connected to the terrace, a young man bangs open a door and slams it behind him. They describe that he had the jaunty manner of a footman, but no livery, and called to us, saying the way into the house was by the way to the cour d'honneur, and offered to show us the way around. He looked inquisitively amused as he walked us down by the French garden till we came to the entrance. From there, the women returned back to their accommodations, and that ended their trip to the Palace of Versailles. As the women began talking about their experiences, it was about 3 months later when they realized that August 10th, the day they visited, was a special date in French history, and we're going to get to that a little bit later. But one of the first things Ms. Lamont did was ask some of her French friends if anyone knew anything about Petit Trianon being haunted, without telling them about their experience or even their visit there. Her friend told her that on a certain day in August, Marie Antoinette is regularly seen sitting outside the garden in front of Petit Trianon, with a light flapping hat and a pink dress. More than this, that the place, especially the farm, the garden, and the path by the water, are peopled with those who used to be there with her. In fact, that all of the occupations and amusements reproduce themselves there for a day. After having such an unusual experience on the grounds, Ms. Lamont, as I think many of us would do, wishes to go back to the same place and see what happens again. And in early January 1902, that is what she does. She heads back to the Palace of Versailles. At first she reports there is no eeriness, there are no the bad feelings, until she crosses a small bridge, at which point it suddenly felt like she crossed a line where she moved back into a similar space they were into on their first visit. She noticed a cart being filled with sticks by 2 laborers, and they wore very unusual outfits, including tunics and capes with pointed hoods of bright colors of terracotta and deep blue. She looks away for a moment, and they're gone. She continues on and gets a little bit lost and ends up in this line of trees where she sees a man wearing a dark cloak and floppy hat, very similar to the man they had observed at the kiosk, slip into some trees not far away from her. Perhaps the most unique experience she has on that return trip, she finds herself on an empty road and has much the same feeling she had the first visit, where she pulls her skirt away as if making room for someone to pass. She suddenly feels in the middle of this empty street as if a throng of people are walking past and through her. She hears bits of French voices close to her ear as they move past, and she says she could hear the faint sound of a band playing, not far off in the distance, but the sounds were intermittent and somehow quite strange. Every time she looks at her map and decides the way she wants to go, she feels in her gut as if she must go the other direction. Before ending her day there, she asks some of the people at the palace if there was a band playing on this day, as she had heard that music, but the staff said, normally there is, but because the day before was New Year's, there was no live music being performed. Ms. Lamont states that the Palace of Versailles, the grounds there, were completely different on her return trip. The spaces between things, the geographical distance had changed, become much shorter, and the foliage and the trees were completely different, and the garden kiosk did not seem to exist. Ms. Lamont brought back a book about Petit Trianon, which inside of it had a painting by Adolphe Wertmuller, which is said to be one of the best likenesses of what Marie Antoinette actually looked like. And Ms. Morrison was extremely shocked when she saw it, as she immediately recognized the face as the same face of the woman she had seen on the lawn in front of Petit Trianon. Over the years, both women returned to Versailles many times, together and separately, but they never again found many of the geographical features, buildings, and people that they experienced on their first visit. As they began to research the things they had seen and experienced on that first trip, a number of interesting discoveries came to light. You will recall the gardeners they ran into on the path, which gave them the very mechanical reply to their request for directions. They asked around at Petit Trianon, Versailles, if anyone working on the grounds would have been wearing those outfits. You recall the long green cloaks, very dignified looking, almost like officials, one of the women wrote. And they were told no, that the individuals working on the grounds wore black, were given the option of wearing white trousers on hot summer days. The women discovered in their research that the outfits they saw these gardeners wearing seemed to match very closely to the outfits worn by those who filled minor roles in the Royal Theatre. These costumes can still be seen today in productions of The Barber of Seville. And when the women told an expert on the grounds in 1904 that they had experienced someone wearing these outfits in 1901, his response was impossible, unless they were masqueraders, or that is someone we would call historical reenactors today, someone wearing historical dress. While speaking with the gardeners, you'll recall Miss Lamont sees a cottage with a woman and a girl in the doorway. In 1904, at the National Library, Ms. Lamont finds a picture from Trianon that matches the cottage. In 1908, she goes back and finds the cottage on the grounds of Versailles. In fact, there are several of these cottages on the grounds, but they are not in the position she saw them in 1901, in a completely different spot. They discover on a map from 1783 a building that would have sat exactly where the cottage was located. And that building no longer existed in 1901. Repeated searches of the grounds over the next 7 or 8 years were unable to locate the kiosk, until Ms. Lamont found evidence of a ruin that once stood where she believed the kiosk had been. They also discover there was no one matching the creepy man sitting beside the kiosk, no one matching his description working at Versailles. However, in 1904, they discover someone in Trianon's history that seems to match very closely the man they saw. His name was Comte de Vaudreuil, who they describe as being Creole and marked by smallpox. He was in the innermost circle of Marie Antoinette, the queen, and somehow played a role in persuading the king to get permission to perform the very politically dangerous play, The Marriage of Figaro. Now, the play was so dangerous for the royal family as it really questioned aristocracy. And the king famously said no to the play being performed because he felt that it would cause the Bastille to be taken. Interesting enough, the Comte de Vaudreuil actually played a role in The Barber of Seville, where he would have been wearing a cloak and a Spanish hat. One of the spookiest parts of the story for me is what I would refer to as the running man. They hear the sound of running footsteps, and suddenly this fellow appears in front of this large rock formation almost magically. What they discovered was there was no one on the grounds at that time wearing that outfit, the green cloak. We've already kind of established that. But there were also no tour guides or people to give instruction or directions. The grounds were more or less just open, so there wouldn't be someone telling people where to go, as this man did. Through all of their visits, they claim to never again find that rustic bridge, which seems to be a key in this somehow as well. But they do find references from 1788 of a bridge that seemed to exactly match the bridge they had crossed over. There was also the jaunty young man who maybe was a footman, that was the impression they had, who came kind of busting out the terrace at them, slamming the door behind him as he came, who eventually showed them the way to get back to the main palace at Versailles. They discovered the door he came out of was part of the chapel, and there had not been anyone doing any type of guiding or any type of instruction on the grounds for over 30 years. And in all the trips the women took back to the grounds, they were never told by anyone, like the running man and like this young fellow who came out of the chapel. No one has ever told them where they need to go. They've been free to roam the property. Also interesting is that one of the employees says that door that he came out of has not been used for a very long time, perhaps even going back to the court of King Louis XVI. And at the time, he said he'd been there 15 years, and he was the key holder, and he is positive that no one has taken the keys from him and unlocked that door. What's also interesting is the interior of that building was extremely dilapidated, making it almost impossible for anyone to go through that door without some acrobatics. Certainly you wouldn't be able to simply walk through it and slam the door behind you. Another interesting consideration is the women claim that the young man closed the door and walked directly to them, more or less in a straight line, without them ever losing sight of them. However, when they've returned to the grounds, they've discovered that path is not possible. In real life, the trip was much longer and would have required traversing 2 flights of stairs, and also there was a chestnut tree placed directly in the way to obscure their observation of that door, as well as there was a courtyard wall there that should have prevented them from seeing this fellow walk in a straight line towards them. But what they discovered was a lot of these changes occurred after the time of Marie Antoinette, and in particular that chestnut tree, which would have obscured their vision, that was planted after the monarchy left. You will also recall the music that Ms. Lamont heard kind of faintly in the distance during her second visit to Petit Trianon, January 2nd, 1902. Now, she was able to write down musically kind of the notes that she heard. And in 1907, they showed the music to a musical expert. And he says that the bars were quite different from each other, as if pulled from different songs. But the time of the music, when this type of music was popular, he said, would have been around the 1780s. They had told him nothing about their experiences there and simply showed him the music. He said bands in the 18th century were lower in pitch than they are now, and that could explain why it sounded slightly strange or unusual or muffled for her. They then go on to the Royal Conservatory of Music in Paris, and they find the notes represent the chief themes of an 18th century opera. And as far as they can see, these notes were not used again in this pattern later than 1815. That's a lot of evidence. And I've never seen a case like this where the people who have experienced potential paranormal activity have gone to such lengths with such detailed notes about what they have discovered. Now, I haven't gone through to check out all their footnotes and to make sure everything they have is historically accurate, but it does seem as if it is. There aren't huge questions about the historical context they pull from. And in the field of paranormal research, it's really unusual to get this first-hand account combined with this personal evidence and research. Now, as there was about 10 years from when they experienced these first events to when the book was published, they had the opportunity to tell quite a few people this story, and they discovered there were common questions they were asked about their experiences, and one chapter of their book and adventure lists kind of a synopsis of the most commonly asked questions and their responses to them. So I'm going to go through those and pick out the key ones. They do admit that one of them is known of having powers of second sight, which we would refer to today as maybe psychic abilities. As far as their religious convictions, they wrote that both of us have inherited the horror of occultism. We belong to no new schools of thought. We are daughters of English clergymen and proudly hold and teach the faith of our fathers. They also wrote they don't believe they influenced each other, and they think their initial reports that they write in the book, which were written 3 months after their visit, show that they had different accounts and different considerations. They state that both of them were in perfect health at the time. They both have reached the conclusion that Petit Trianon is haunted. And they state that the research had originally begun to disprove that anything unusual had happened to them or anyone else. They do not believe what they experienced can be explained by coincidences, as there simply would be far too many of them. In response to the questions, could it be masqueraders or political reenactors or people in costume, they answer that even if that were so, there is no explanation how the running man got over the pile of rocks. It also doesn't explain why the kiosk doesn't seem to be in existence. It would also not explain the topographical changes and how the young man came so quickly from an unused and locked chapel door. The people they saw, they say, were small and isolated from one another, and there was silence everywhere. The research also turned up there were no permits for photography given out for that day. One of the most obvious questions they got asked was, why would this happen to you two of all people? And they admit they are somewhat puzzled and wrote, "We are constantly asked why we, of all people, should have such an adventure. We are equally puzzled, and have come to think it may not be so unusual as it seems. We can imagine that people, even if they suspected anything unusual, which they might easily not do, may have thought it best not to follow up. The peculiarity in our case may simply have been that two persons were equally able to consider the circumstances, and did do so, and that we found there was evidence available, and we had the opportunity to obtain it." This is a very interesting point, and a very broad point, as they suggest that maybe unusual stuff like this is happening to people at Versailles, or maybe other places, all the time. We just don't pay attention. And I think this is true. I think we've all in our personal lives had some experience where something suddenly seems uncanny or strange, or we do a double take, but we don't follow it up with research. It's often just brushed off as our imagination. And I guess this poses the question, well, what if it's not? While much of the women's research was impressive, they thought their big discovery was connected to the date they visited, August 10th, as that's a very important day in the course of the French Revolution. To set the scene for you, on October 6th, 1789, Louis XVI and his family, including Marie Antoinette, were forced to leave Versailles and were brought to the Tuileries, the palace in Paris, where they were kept under very tight surveillance. For the next 2 years, the palace remained the official residence of the king. The royal family tried to escape after dark on June 20th, 1791, but were captured and brought back to the Tuileries. The following year, August 10th, 1792, the palace was stormed by an armed mob, which overwhelmed and massacred the Swiss Guard as the royal family fled through the gardens and took refuge with the Legislative Assembly. Sometime between 7 a.m. and 9 a.m., Louis XVI relinquished his power to save his family. Try to imagine what that scene would be like, particularly to the royal family. You've just been stripped of all your power. Your fate has been completely put in the hands of the Legislative Assembly, and there is a mob of people surrounding the building and yelling for your head. The legislature tries to figure out what to do with the royal family, and in the meantime escorts them into a small room that is very meager and far below their standards. Without any opportunity for resting and meals, the king and queen and the family remain in the room until 10 p.m. with no food, no water. Finally, the following day, some refreshments were brought to them. And what the authors Morrison and Lamont want us to consider is how extreme the queen's emotions would have been, as the power she so desperately clung to was now completely gone, and earlier in the day she had seen her most trusted servants and guards massacred. This led Morrison and Lamont to believe they had somehow entered the memories of Marie Antoinette, that during this extremely devastating, difficult, terrifying time, she had gone back in her own mind to a place that she had found peace and rest, Le Petit Trianon. Morrison and Lamont wrote, "We wondered whether we had inadvertently entered within an act of the Queen's memory when alive, and whether this explained our curious sensation of being completely shut in and impressed. What more likely, we thought, it was during those hours in the Hall of Assembly she had gone back in such vivid memory to other Augusts spent at Trianon that some impression of it was imparted to the place." On the surface, this sounds like a pretty extraordinary claim to be able to go back into someone's memories at a place that was particularly memorable to them. And many critics who have read it but want to believe what the women are saying have thought maybe a better term to refer to this as is a time slip. And think of a time slip as kind of spontaneous time travel, where you are in current day and then suddenly, and usually briefly, find yourself in another time period. Now, Einstein says this is theoretically possible. Probable is another question, of course, altogether. But there have been other reports of these time slips taking place, where, for example, travelers report staying the night at a hotel that has not been in existence for hundreds of years, or where suddenly you see automobiles or other modes of transportation which have not existed or not popularly existed for hundreds of years as well. The idea of suddenly time traveling on your own without provocation is certainly a very interesting one that you could further explore. And when we hear an extraordinary story like this, it's always necessary to look at the other side of the coin. Are there elements of the story that don't make sense? Are there better explanations than this kind of very supernatural time travel haunting tale? And the women did take a lot of fire, a lot of skepticism when the book was published, despite how popular it was. And the first and foremost claim, of course, was that these women were just flat out lying. They were charlatans, and they had written a fiction to fit pre-existing historical evidence they had or they could use. Now, some obvious questions follow this line of thinking is if they were really interested in notoriety or fame, money, those kinds of things, why would they publish under pseudonyms? And consideration has to be given that if their real identities were discovered, as they were eventually many years later, that is two kind of upstanding women with reasonably respected positions in the community, that this type of ghost story could in some ways damage their reputation. I also struggle if it's the case that this is just completely a hoax and designed to trick us into thinking it's real, as to why the women's accounts would be slightly different. You'd expect maybe the accounts to be very similar, but there are key moments here. The seeing the potential Marie Antoinette, seeing that cottage, where only one woman saw these things. Now, is it the case that maybe that was part of the hoax, kind of a reverse psychology thing? Well, if they're slightly different accounts, maybe that makes them more truthful. I'm not sure, but it is an interesting question to ponder. I've already mentioned perhaps the most prevalent theory to debunk this whole story, and that's they simply didn't realize they had wandered into historical actors doing stuff. They had misjudged what was happening around them and were just simply mistaken about what they saw. And this was the opinion of the Society for Psychical Research, which the women reached out to very shortly after they visited there to proclaim, Versailles is haunted. You got to check this out. But they suggested that the women had just misinterpreted the events. Nothing unusual had happened, and their certainty about what happened kind of hints at it being a shared delusion. In 1903, an old map of the gardens was found that showed a bridge that the two women claimed to have not been on any other map. So is it possible just that their memory was perhaps a little poor? They had gotten lost. The topography they saw in one place was really in another. Well, I think those are all fair questions. Another interesting aspect to this is that both women have reported to have had other paranormal experiences both before and after their adventure. And a good question here is, does someone having multiple paranormal experiences make them less believable or more believable? Yeah, I guess it depends which theory you subscribe to. If you believe there are certain people that have certain gifts, somehow have some connection to other things than just literally what we see in front of us, well, maybe that can be used to reinforce the idea, well, this person is very sensitive and this is a place where there is potential activity. The other side of the coin has to be, though, is it possible because paranormal experiences are fairly few and far between, could someone having multiple of them imply that perhaps there's an element of this that is not truthful, or perhaps something that is rather wished for than actually having taken place? Now, Ms. Morrison, she claimed to have seen at the Louvre in 1914 an apparition of the Roman Emperor Constantine, a man of unusual height wearing a gold crown and toga. He was not observed by anyone else. During the First World War, Ms. Lamont, who had gone on to become a principal of her own, became convinced that a German spy was hiding in her college. And after developing increasingly autocratic behavior, she died suddenly in 1924 in the middle of an academic scandal over her leadership of the college, her conduct having provoked mass resignations in the academic staff. So are there personality traits of these two women making their other claims a little bit of paranoia that might influence our reading of their description of their visit to Versailles in 1901? The most damaging analysis of their claims appeared in 1950, written by W.H. Salter. Salter concluded, based upon a close review of the correspondence the women had with the Society for Psychical Research, that many of the details in the accounts they claimed to have written in 1901 had actually been added at a much later date. He believed it was likely that the two women sincerely believed that they saw something mysterious on their visit to Versailles in 1901, but their memories began to become influenced by the research they were conducting, and the two eventually matched up. Is it possible that Ms. Morrison and Ms. Lamont somehow managed to enter the memories of Marie Antoinette, or somehow slipped in time to the days of King Louis XVI's court? I think it all depends on the credibility you give to their first-hand account, because unlike many cases, there is quite a bit of historical evidence that if their initial reports are true and accurate, seem to imply something unusual happened. However, making that leap to really believe what they have said and that they were not influenced by their research or by time, age, confusion, any of those factors, is a leap you would have to make. Like all great ghost stories, at the end, there is no answer, but simply more questions. Thank you so much for joining us for the episode today. As I'm sure many of you listening have actually been to Versailles, if you have photos of yourself there at the Palace or at Petit Trianon, we would love to see those. So please feel free to share them with us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Snapchat, all at Haunted Walk. To be sure you know when the new episodes of the show are coming out, please subscribe to wherever you're listening to the show. We're doing our best to try to put them out on the last Friday of each month. For information about our tours, including our special 150 years of Canada's scariest ghost stories in Ottawa this summer, and our special tours at Black Creek Pioneer Village in Toronto, be sure to visit our website, hauntedwalk.com. And always feel free to reach out to me if you have questions, show ideas. My email is jim@hauntedwalk.com. Until we meet again, sweet dreams.